This is Jack Stanley, and this is number 11 in our talk on the American presidency, and we complete Lincoln. Now, I have to tell you something that I find very important about Abraham Lincoln is that his history, much of it, has been poorly reported. A lot of his history has been falsified. A lot of the actions of Lincoln have been hidden. A lot of what went on in Lincoln's administration has been adulterated. And the history and the understandings of this individual, this human being named Abraham Lincoln, are often lost in the sauce, one might say. I will tell you that if you do wish to study Lincoln, I'll recommend these 3 books. It's called Hernan's Lincoln. It's the first edition, by the way. And Hernan was Lincoln's law partner. Much of the history written by Hernan has been dismissed by historians for one of the main reasons that it makes Lincoln a little too human. And I think it's wonderful. Now, I must tell you, the American Civil War, the United States itself after the Civil War, basically what the United States becomes all comes from the mind of Lincoln. I'm not going to go into the Civil War because we're talking about the American presidency. But the thing is that the American presidency, that the United States, that every aspect of government changes in the administration of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln reinvents the United States. The Civil War is not fought over slavery. That is not true at all. Of course, it was a contributing factor, but it certainly wasn't the cause of the war. Abraham Lincoln doesn't get a great deal of the vote. Everything breaks apart. He does not accept the fact that the South is left. He refuses to accept that. His notion is that the Civil War is basically to keep the Union together. He looks at it. In fact, he mentions that he has a sacred oath in heaven to preserve the Union. Everything was Union. It wasn't about slavery. It was about Union. And that was Lincoln. I don't want to get past Lincoln because, well, I can spend a long, long time talking about him, and there's so many different aspects of him. But the important thing to know about our 16th president is that he redefines, he reinvents, he sets up every aspect of a new country. And that Congress, following his lead and also arguing against some of it, comes up with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which basically takes the United States, takes the Declaration of Independence, takes the Constitution, takes most of our ideals of government and changes them around and knocks them on their head. The Civil War is a dreadful war. Any civil war is a dreadful war. Was Lincoln great? I think he was in many respects. I think he was perhaps the greatest intellect we ever had in the presidency. He was raw intellect. Much of who he was is lost. Much of what he did is not told. The Abraham Lincoln that existed no one ever hears about. But we always hear about this fictional character called Lincoln. Read Hernan's Lincoln, and you will discover a very different animal in the pages of this book. So let us remember that Lincoln, who becomes our first president to be assassinated, one has to think about Lincoln. Many people have said, and even John Hay speculated, that Lincoln seemed to will his own assassination, his own death. One thing also about Lincoln is that perhaps we didn't have anyone in office who was as ambitious as Lincoln. Lincoln spent his entire life working toward becoming president. You know, at the age of 29, he spoke before the Young Man's Lyceum and basically gave a speech on the power of the presidency. And here, many years later, he becomes president. And maybe he has to atone for his sins, you might say. He used that a lot. Also have to remember something else, that no one started using God more than Lincoln. He discovered it worked well. And Lincoln, as I said, would totally change the presidency, totally change the country, totally change everything. And perhaps in the history of the American presidency, no one has a more profound effect upon the office, the changes of the office, the changes in the power of the office, the changes in the weakness, or you might say the flexibility of the Constitution. As I mentioned before in a previous video, he stretched the Constitution to such a degree it snapped. He was a dictator. Well, he had to be. You had a war. However, he used the power of being a dictator in very, very vicious ways. The Lincoln that you know, the Lincoln that we often talk about, the Lincoln that we hear about, very rarely represents the man who actually was our 16th president, assassinated and died right after the Civil War basically ended. It was ever so symbolic. I will add that had he not been assassinated, there would be no Lincoln Memorial. Lincoln might have been looked upon as a scoundrel. Because, if you think about one of the things that he did, which was the Proclamation of Emancipation, which really didn't do anything in many respects, because it really wasn't a government document. It freed the slaves in the South, where he had no power. But one thing that document did state was that the slaves in the North and the border states were still slaves, and they would remain slaves until the war was over. In fact, until the 13th Amendment. Brilliant man, fantastic poet, fantastic writer. But was he who we make him out to be? No. Someday, I think there'll be a really good history of Lincoln. I think Gore Vidal did a fantastic job of humanizing him. Hernan did a phenomenal job. He goes into the whole thing with his syphilis and the like. A lot of people don't want to hear about this. But Lincoln was human. Lincoln had frailties. And Lincoln had a law partner for 17 years named Hernan. And Hernan learned a lot about Lincoln. And through Hernan, we learn who Lincoln really was. So, That's enough about Lincoln. Let us continue in the presidency, because after Lincoln, who is a very powerful figure, we have a lot that aren't too powerful and are a little questionable in many respects.